really emulates that feeling of reading a book.
You have to make a case that this is better.
I'm going to lose all my savings on this.
I disagree. Here's the actual size.
I have to say, I love the combat in this.
I'm a sucker for some good magic systems.
Skill trumps power in ways that lend themselves very well to a 20-plus level progression system.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Infinite Tavern podcast, where we talk to players, GMs, designers, artists, writers, streamers, and others about their life in the TTRPG community. And sometimes we do actual plays as well.
Yeah,
We are
everyone in the TTRPG realm, actually.
Yeah, that actually encompasses everyone.
Every single person.
Yeah. Well, we are your favorite hosts. I'm Amaan, an indie TTRPG and horror aficionado and certified dragon swan to the Wheel of Time. And we have...
And I'm Anurag, Lord of the Rings nerd, mostly. Basically a super fan of Lord of the Rings. And, the guy who runs way too many campaigns on his server, Anurag. Also known as Raghav in the common world.
And in this special episode, we have not one, but two guests representing Brotherwise Games, the radiant order behind the little bit talked about, raised some money for their game, not a lot, like $7 million or so, broke all records. The people behind the Cosmere role-playing game, based on and canonically part of the Cosmere novels by Brandon Sanderson. We have the creative director, John Smith, Johnny O'Neill, and we have Ruvaid Virk, the edge dancer and the writer for the Mistborn Campaign Setting. Hello, guys. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah, very happy to be here.
We are so glad to have you guys. I mean, the first time I reached out to you, I was expecting, probably like, hey, thanks for contacting us. We are really, really busy right now, and probably will get back to you soon. I wasn't expecting a reply like ASAP from the team itself. So I'm really happy we got to do this, and our community is excited as well. They have been looking forward to this, especially all the Brandon Sanderson nerds, because there are a lot of them in our community, to be honest.
And especially because a lot of people in our community have a bunch of questions for you, which we'll be coming to later. But they have a lot of questions to ask you, and we are excited to know the answers to them as well.
Great.
But before we get into this, just a quick roundup. Johnny, Ruvaid, why don't you, sort of not just introduce yourself to our community, but just talk about how you got into TTRPGs in the first place itself.
Johnny, do you wanna go first?
Sure. I'll go first because I probably got into them first. I grew up with a big brother, the other brother in Brotherwise Games, who went off to college when I was 10 years old and he was 18, and he left behind all of his RPG stuff. He also left behind all his Marvel comics, and I just spent a lot of my childhood reading through those things over and over again. Never actually getting to play D&D. I think I played it once when I was 9 years old, but having all of his old D&D stuff, all of his old Palladium Games stuff, mini back issues of Dragon Magazine, and just sort of poring over those things and dreaming of them. And then as I got to be a teenager and a little bit older, I actually started to do some playing. Once I was in my 20s, I got even more into it. I ran the first big sort of fan site, back when fan sites were a thing, for the Mistborn Campaign Setting, which is how I met Keith Baker. And getting to know him sort of was one of my first little steps into the world of working professionally in games. It was an early one, but it was a toe in the water, and gave me a sense of, there are people who actually do this as a job. I wrote a couple articles for Dragon Magazine back in that time, but that was still, there was a long way between that and me actually working professionally in games. But yeah, that's my journey.
Yeah, as far as my journey goes, yeah, I think Johnny, you're definitely right. You got into TTRPGs far earlier than I did.
1990 was me.
Yeah. I didn't get into TTRPGs until I was in college, actually. I had been an avid reader, fantasy novels, Lord of the Rings, Aragon, all the classic. I grew up in the '90s and early 2000s, so I was an avid reader. But it wasn't until college that I made some friends who were super into Pathfinder. And I was like, well, I've heard about D&D and these other things, and like it seems like it would be a lot of fun. It seems really up my alley, and so I started there, and that turned into playing Pathfinder, turned into testing out Pathfinder 2, answering open calls on Twitter. So I've got some history working with Paizo, and since then it's kind of just been one thing after another, and I managed to find my way here with Brotherwise, which I'm quite happy about.
Very recently, I've gotten into Pathfinder. There were small groups of players here and there over here, but generally it was very restricted to a particular location or a particular group of friends. It was only during the pandemic that we got to have a literal community of people over here getting into it. And yeah, it's just been a few years. We still feel like, oh, we are so fresh. Even our little community, even our little podcast, how they welcome us. It's been, it's very different from all other industries, I'd say.
For sure, for sure. And it's interesting how the pandemic, which you would think would have had a negative impact on people coming together at the table, actually connected people because people started to use digital tools like Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds and now Foundry to kind of come together and started to realize how many other fans there were out there. Yeah, we've seen it's been a real period of growth. I was going to say I don't think there could be a better time for us to be launching something like this. So we got lucky on that front.
I would say if it wasn't for these online tools like Owlbear or Roll20, I don't know if we would have gotten this far as we have right now.
Yeah, online tools certainly have helped.
I mean,
Yeah,
thanks
I
a
think
lot
the
for.
accessibility, yeah, tools and people, right? It just has widened the net. Like all of my games are online at this point. I've met all my closest RPG friends online at this point. I mean, and I think it's a good time to be an enjoyer of tabletop games.
You know what I
Yeah,
used to do? I used to play by post on
Play by
a
post.
website called mythweavers.com.
Oh,
So I had
damn.
a pretty boring job in my early 20s, and one where I would have late hours at times, but I'd be stuck waiting for work to do for hours at a time, sometimes during the middle of the day. And so I would just go on. I had a couple different campaigns I was running or involved in at any given time. And I would just, type up a post, hit enter, and then, somebody else would come in. I mean, talk about situations where you really didn't want to get into super long combats when it was playing at the pace of one turn every 20 or 30 minutes as somebody would chime in. But that was all part of the journey and sort of helped keep my interest in game design going. And I still look back very fondly on some of the campaigns that I ran back then. I was playing D&D at the time, but with some of the original like Pathfinder adventure paths before there was the split.
Coming to that, since you guys have I would say compared to us, a long history with TTRPGs, I'm assuming you had a long history with reading fantasy novels as well. When can you specify a point in time where you got into Cosmere?
For me, I would say it was after I finished Wheel of Time.
Oh, it's same.
Yeah, I would say I got through the Wheel of Time, and I said, hey, this Brandon Sanderson guy, he finished the last three books. I'm kind of a fan of what he did here, and then I was like, well, let me see what else he's got going on, and he had posted like a free link or a cheap link to a PDF of Way of Kings on Reddit, and so I downloaded it and uh, went through that for the first time, and then started on the actual path of like Mistborn, and then have like followed it pretty much ever since.
I just went down my list of 219 Audible titles and was trying to figure out how early in that. I sorted by recent, and it doesn't say the date or anything, but it was pretty close to 10 years ago now, maybe 8 years. At the time, had a commute that was at least 45 minutes each way, and driving through LA traffic, which is you barely need any of your brain power to just sort of move your car slowly through the gridlock. And so I would just start listening to audiobooks, and I'd crank up the speed to the point where I wouldn't lose, I wouldn't get bored by it. So, usually like 1.7, 1.8 times speed, and just, Michael Kramer and Kate Redding kind of kept me company through many long hours, and I became very captivated by the Cosmere. I was at the time, it was still fairly early in Brotherwise history. I was working on a game called Call to Adventure, which was inspired mostly actually by Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicle, The Name of the Wind, and Wise Man's Fear. And as I was working on that game, and it was sort of a character building fantasy themed game, I thought, it would be really cool to be able to do expansions. And so I reached out to a few different people. I reached out to Patrick Rothfuss, who immediately said yes. We'd done some promo stuff, some support for his charity World Builders through our game Boss Monster, which was the game that started our little company. So that was a yes. George R.R. Martin never returned my calls. Matthew Mercer did, but Critical Role was just starting to sort of blow up then, and sort of between them having other games they were starting to work on and me thinking, oh man, I'm not going to be able to, watch 100 hours of Critical Role content to like fully like catch up. That one sort of fell a little bit by the wayside. But Brandon Sanderson, encouraged by the fact I was working with Patrick, said, yeah, sure, you can, don't do it on Kickstarter. At the time, he was sort of wary of doing Kickstarter for anything except internal Dragonsteel projects. But he said, if you can do it without that, then go for it. So even during, we did do a Kickstarter for just the base version of Call to Adventure. And the day that we announced that Brandon would eventually be involved was the day we just saw like a huge spike in our numbers. And that was my first hint of like, this Brandon guy sure has a passionate fan base. And I was a part of it. I had some sense of it. I saw how big the subreddits were and all that. But working on that game that Ruvaid has over his left shoulder there, that ended up being really great. I had an instant rapport with Isaac Stewart on Brandon's team. And we did, I forget how many illustrations are. There's something like 125 illustrations in that game. And they were really happy with them. They really appreciated our attention to detail. And at that point, the illustrations weren't quite at the level of like, these need to be 100% official, but they had to be close. They couldn't be wrong. And because that project went so well, when I said, hey, what if we tried some miniatures? Isaac and Brandon said yes. And then that project went in some ways even better. We're working even more closely with Brandon to make sure that those were all like 100% canonical. Like we went through like 20 versions of the Lopen before he was happy with one. And that was when we finally said, okay, it feels like we work really well together. We're a game company. People really want an RPG. What if we did that? And we started those discussions a few years ago.
Yeah, I had a question though. So you said, how you got into Cosmere and everything. So my question is, what about this world made you stay?
The world building and the excellent plots, the very exciting, intricate plots, are things that a lot of people talk about and a lot of people like. But I'd say ultimately, sort of, I stayed for the characters and really getting attached to these characters that Brandon built. And I think a cool thing as somebody who grew up on RPGs is, in an RPG, you go from being like an ordinary person to being like a demigod in a typical sort of D&D style RPG. And that's a very cool journey to watch. Some of the old like D&D novels, like, I don't know, like the Cleric Quintet, like there were some that sort of followed that journey, but Brandon pulled off that sort of progression fantasy in a way where you were still connected to the characters. You could see somebody go from, to being a literal god in some cases that I won't mention because of spoilers. That was just really fun to see, and that he could sort of write at all different levels of that with really clear prose that has a great sense of time and can compress moments into really those 10 heartbeats of his combats and things like that. Really came through. So yeah, that was kind of what kept me going and kept me in, and then seeing all the connections come together, that is a pretty fun thing.
Yeah, I think I definitely have to agree with all of that what Johnny said. Right, it was just the character work. I think like the world building draws you in, the character work keeps you in. And I'm a sucker for some good magic systems, and Brandon has that down. One of the things that I really enjoy, for especially with like Stormlight and more of his recent stuff, is like I come from a mental health background, and so seeing him tackle a lot of these issues with his characters that maybe you don't really see in other typical fantasy novels and areas was really really awesome for me to see, and engaging with that in an appropriate and also like educational sort of way, but still like, hey, and at the same time, right, just weaving that into these really cool, the really cool worlds, and making them part, and seeing characters progress with all that in mind has been a very nice journey.
That's a really good point. And especially to your point where you talked about Brandon writing really hard, in a good way, hard magic systems, is you can already imagine the kind of mechanics that happens, behind the scenes. How did the canon of the magic system formulate this RPG, and what did the early iterations of the Cosmere RPG kind of look like in the beginning?
I'll try to keep things a little low on spoilers. I mean, one of the ways that Brandon carries you through the story is by revealing details about the magic system. So in some ways, talking about the magic system is a type of spoiler, but I somewhat differentiate between world building spoilers and character plot spoilers. So I won't name any specific characters, but I will reference things like, some of the things about how the magic works and how, the ecology of the worlds, things like that. In my experience, understanding those things just makes you enjoy the books even more. So one thing that's very cool is that Brandon has a really clear sense of how investiture, the magic system underlying the Cosmere, works. There are things that he doesn't have completely in his head. It's not like a Tolkien situation where he's completely built up the linguistics and the history and every kind of last biblical detail of this world and is now just sort of writing it out. No, he's left himself a lot of room in the stories to improvise and to have some gray areas that he's going to fill in as he goes. Even within the magic, like how the surge of tension works, he has a sense of it. He was able to provide rules for it that we could put into the RPG, but when you actually see it applied in the books, there may be some techniques or some nuance to it that he introduces at that time. But one of the very first things we did on this project, is actually prior to Ruvaid joining, was having a creative summit where we asked him what he wanted to see in the RPG. We asked him questions that we had about the canon and about that underlying world and mechanics. And where he said some things, he sort of kicked things off by saying, here are the rules of magic. Here are some things about it that are fundamental. And we all furiously took notes as he talked about things like, there's no time travel in his magic system. There's no multiverse in his magic system. There are 3 realms, but there's not alternate realities and things like that. So some of it was like, what are the restrictions? What are things that you won't see? You can go to a vision of the past, but you're not going to ever get into a Harry Potter time turner situation. So those were some of the constraints. Other things are like, certain magic systems work the same across various books. So in Mistborn, you have seekers who can burn bronze to detect allomantic pulses, and by interpreting those pulses, get a sense of where a Mistborn might be, where an allomancer might be, and what metal they might be burning. Somebody with that power and the right know-how can come to Roshar and do the same thing for surge binding. or for some of the rhythms that the singers use to speak. So these are things that are married across his systems, and which from a game design perspective is awesome, because we can then layer those in. We can say, instead of, as Ruvaid's working on, the secret tree, he doesn't have to say, this detects allomancy. He can say, this detects active use of investiture. And that makes it a lot more interesting once you bring everything together. There's still things to get into and details that we need to follow up with as we're working on these things. Like, how does a copper cloud interact with a light weaving illusion? How does it interact with the telepathic communication between the hordlings of a sleepless swarm? So I don't have those answers for you today, or at least if I have them, I'll keep them a secret. But there are answers to those things. And because it's built on this sort of like fictional physics that has its own rules, it gives us a way of looking ahead to magic systems he hasn't even created yet, and know that kind of the system we're building is still going to work with those as long as we abide by certain rules.
Actually, you kind of sort of answered what I was going to ask you when you made that point. Like, how are you avoiding conflicts and maintaining that sort of consistency, across these different worlds, and especially when you have these different team of writers and designers who are working on different campaign settings. Like Scadrial and Roshar are like very different. I mean, they read differently in the novels itself.
Yeah. I mean, maybe asking Ruvaid. So I would say most of the people working on Scadrial right now did work on Roshar. Ruvaid is one of the people who snatched into the project more recently, and who we're very glad to have on the team. Ruvaid, what's it like sort of stepping into this where, we had a framework, we had ideas of how we wanted to handle Mistborn pretty early in the project, but now the rubber's hitting the road. Now you're actually designing those things. I'd say feel free to get into details there, just knowing that as we're still working on some of this stuff and testing it, some of the details might change.
As you say, the setting of Scadrial and Roshar are different for sure, and I think the way that I've approached it here is really making sure to bring that the different setting alive, right? Like, get into what makes Scadrial feel unique, what makes the powers, the magic system on Scadrial, what makes them fun to use, what people are envisioning, and the work on Roshar and Stormlight set up a good framework for how we wanted things to work in terms of like the overall system. Framework of the system, right? But now on Scadrial with Mistborn, we get to play around more with it. Allomancy, honing in on these, on all the very unique powers that each of the metals has. Right? There's 10 paths, there's the surges and Roshar, but there's 16 elementic powers, there's 16 ferrochemical powers, there's there's hemalurgy, there's twinborn, there's compounding, and so the complexity, potential complexity, like can increase. But while designing this, right, we keep in mind, well, how do when I'm designing something like copper clouds, right? How do we make this both feel unique and fun, and keep it interacting with the world as a whole? What are some moments from the books that we can look at? And because you read Mistborn and you say, hey, I want to do the thing that Wax does, right? I want to be a coin shot. I want to pewter drag myself from city to city, and these are certainly touch points that we keep in mind. And but even beyond that, it's a matter of, well, we see what Brandon wants us to see in the books. There are powers like tin, for example, right? He brings up, and then you kind of you have tin. People are using tin; they increase their senses, and that's what it does. And he doesn't really, at this point, hasn't extrapolated too much more on that outside of what he's already done. designing this, we get into the opportunity to see, well, where are places that we can extrapolate, where are places that we can showcase these powers in ways that maybe haven't been explicitly shown yet, and that's a big advantage of working directly with Dragonsteel and seeing just what we can put in here to get people excited and really show off some of these the complexity and like narrative uses of these really really cool powers on Scadrial.
So I'm assuming that there's some more things happening behind the scenes that we might eventually see in 2026 or late 2025. Like that's the vibe that I'm getting from this.
Yeah, I mean, so we've got our Mistborn releases will be in 2026. One thing that we were just working on this yesterday, actually, kind of looking to the future. So we've got Stormlight 2025, Mistborn 2026. In 2027 and 2028, that's when we're looking at sort of World Hopper and Elantris content. But the exact sequence of that, it depends a little bit on a number of things. So we're keeping that a little more up in the air for now. Brandon's also working on new books constantly. And a phrase he used early on that the marketing guy immediately jumped onto was a living RPG. And I really like the idea that, like, wow, because he's working on this world, this can continue to grow. This was something I feel like in the late 90s, like World of Darkness was sort of doing this in various White Wolf games were trying to kind of do this. Even in D&D, there was sort of like the idea that there was like a meta story that was happening that was sort of progressing through the books. And eventually it was like they stopped trying to do that. They just sort of said, yep, here's the Forgotten Realms. This is what's just go play in the Forgotten Realms, treating it a little bit more as just a little more static setting because that's easy for people to jump into and all that. But what I really like about having this evolving continuity is it gives us this very natural, organic reason to keep bringing in new stuff. So the next Mistborn series is going to take Mistborn into a Cold War era sort of 1980s-ish setting, and
so cool.
and we're going to have access to that like well before it actually hits bookstore shelves. And so we can start weaving that into what we're working on and come out with an early maybe online supplement that supports that, while then building up to a full book that comes out once the third Ghost Blood trilogy book hits bookstore shelves. So we can line up with those things. There's a novella coming out in Stormlight called Horneater, and that's not going to be enough to justify an entire hardcover release like one of these books, but it's surely going to give us material for some kind of supplement that we can put out there and updates and things like that. So that's pretty neat. So it means that even as we're releasing, even as we have a Mistborn year, we'll have some more Stormlight stuff to talk about. And even as we move into World Hopper or Elantris, we'll have some more Mistborn stuff we can talk about, and we'll just continue to grow and evolve. But I'm reading the next Secret Project book right now, and I don't think it's a big spoiler to say that it takes place far in the future. And we've seen that in some of the other Secret Projects novels that take place far in the future. So we might be starting out with swords and surge binding, but we get to a point where we've got like starfighters, and we're kind of like Pathfinder, Starfinder. Like we've got to build a rule set that can accommodate both from the ground up. That at the same time we're figuring out how much damage a shard blade does. We got to be thinking ahead to how much damage does like an energy weapon do, and all that. So.
Yeah, and even right now, right, with Mistborn and Stormlight, you have guns on Scadrial. You don't have guns on Stormlight.
That's the part where you guys, I guess, have to work out the balance in that, and your basic action economy compared to what if somebody just a random situation where somebody is working with a shard blade and somebody who has a gun. How do you balance that?
Yeah, the good news is it's all basically like different flavors of deadly, right? And so most of these weapons, whether it's like an an arrow through the heart or a bullet through the heart or a shard blade through the spine. None of these things do you want to have happen to you. And so our health system is based on, a sort of abstraction of stamina, where this is you avoiding getting that last hit that really takes you out. And when you hit 0 hit points, you're not unconscious in this system, you're injured. You might be out of the fight, but you have to get injured more than once to be at risk of death. Unless we do have a special injury table for shard blades. But that takes some inspiration from the past sort of sci-fi RPGs where you've got like high damage weapons, or like, I spent a lot of years playing Star Wars D20, where traditional weapons, more sort of primitive weapons, dealt 1 die of damage, but a blaster is like 3d6. A lightsaber is like 3d8, or kind of depends on how high level a Jedi you are, depending on the system. But this is a fairly deadly system combat-wise. Combat is meant to be quick and decisive, and defense values are low, damage values are high, in order to replicate the kind of drama that we see in the books. And it ends up feeling, I think, pretty cinematic.
I'm still in the first book though, but I have to say, I love the combat in this. These books have the best combat I've ever seen so far.
Yeah, Brandon has a real knack for writing time. Like when he can extend things that go very long and sort of feel more epic in scope. But when he drills down and zooms into combat, you feel it. It's like split seconds are very impactful and all that. So I think that's I think Brandon's actual prose and writing is often underrated, and I think that's one aspect of it that is really strong.
You feel the pace of the combat in there.
Yeah.
And that is the best part of the book for me.
This is like 2 questions in one. While you were while you guys were making iterations of the RPG itself, what was the mechanic which went? Again, this is the community question that we got from members. What was the mechanic that went under the most number of iterations, and what was something that was really hard for you to balance?
So, with the disclaimer of I came in a little later into the project with Mistborn. As far as like abilities that we're still trying to iterate down at this point. A big part of that balanced iteration process I found is interacting with our initiative system.
Yeah.
Right, the slow turns and fast turns, where you get 2 actions or you get 3 actions.
It's fun.
And adjusting things like action costs. For example, stances on warrior. Adjusting when can you take a stance? Is it worth taking this? Spending 2 actions to take a stance? Is it a good idea for people to be able to do that when combat starts? How much do you have to have leveled up in order to do that? And I think that for a lot of the different mechanics in the game, the abilities, the talent trees, it comes down to making sure that they feel good to use at the right opportunities as intended, with the 2 and 3 actions in mind during the initiative, because we don't want to put options in there that people are just never going to take, like aluminum allomancy, for example, right? If you're just on Scadrill, that doesn't really do anything if that's your only allomantic power. But from a larger perspective of the Cosmere and the game, it has other potential uses. That's certainly something we've kept in mind while we've designing things like the talents and the heroic paths and so on.
Yeah, one thing that's really important about our system is that we have these talent trees, what we call paths, instead of traditional classes, and that has a huge impact on what it's like to build a character in this system. So you don't need to sort of pick one class and rigidly stick to it. You're able to really have a character who's very diversified in their capabilities. You're rewarded for some specialization, but you don't need to specialize. And the Radiant paths work the same way. in Stormlight, all of the paths are set up in the same structure, essentially. You've got an entry talent and then 3 branches, each of which have 8 talents. But Mistborn, we shake that up completely. In Mistborn, the aluminum path might be just 1 talent, maybe 2, but probably just 1. And there are other talents like, the Seeker talents of just sort of being able to detect other, use of investiture. That could be a cool power. It's a little bit like having like detect magic or certain depending on the situation, it can kind of operate like just sort of like being clairvoyant or like being able to find somebody, but it's not so powerful that you want it to be an 8 talent tree. So that one might be 3 talents. Ruvaid, you might know that better than I do, sort of where it is right now. But whereas something like steel pushing or iron pulling, those are a little bit richer. Those have a little bit more going on, and so that's a neat aspect of how we've built a very modular system that allows us to build out each magic system in a way that fits what it needs to do. Similarly, we have Surge Binding and Allomancy operate like skills to see how good your power level, sort of the number of ranks you have in that skill, or the number of talents you have invested in that tree has an impact on your power level. But the biggest thing, if you want to just do a cool thing with magic, you roll your die, add your modifier for that type of magic, and narrate the results. And that imposes or gives us a lot of flexibility that traditional kind of like Vancian slot-based D&D Pathfinder style magic wouldn't be a good fit for. When we get to Elantris, and you've got Aeons, which are specific sort of magical runes that have more defined effects, that might look a little more like D&D style magic. Even that has room for customization and things like that would be skill-based, but it at least lends itself better to that. Ferrochemy, where you are tapping and storing and tapping a particular attribute like strength or speed, that's not going to be as skill-based. That's going to be more of a one-to-one. Okay, I put some strength into this. Now I'm expending a charge to get some strength. So each magic system gets to be its own thing, feel very different, even though they're all hooked into the same rule set. And the action economy is a big part of that, where Mistborn are very quick with what they can do. Drawing an Aeon, you can do just about anything. You can reshape reality itself, but you might spend 3 actions doing it, or even 4. So there's a lot of tools we've given ourselves to be able to balance things out over the course of these different releases. And a very strong theme in Brandon's books is that skill trumps raw power. So he's got a story right now. It's only been a graphic novel, White Sand, which is going to become novelized in the next year or two. And the whole point of that is there's this guy who's got less raw power than everybody, but he's been so intent on being good at what he does that he's found ways around that and ways to pull things off that nobody else can just through skill alone. And so you can be a Mistborn, at a very low level. You're just going to be like Vin at the beginning of Mistborn, totally in training, not with powers where maybe outside of combat you could successfully still push something, but in the split second heat of combat, your powers just aren't honed enough yet to make a big difference. And by investing in talents as you level up, you'll get better and better and better. But you'll never be as good as somebody at your same level who specializes in one metal. And that is something that we see as Vin goes through her training. She spends time with people who are specialized. We see in Era 2, Wayne, who's just a master of disguise, setting aside any allomantic powers he has, he's just a really high level agent spy or agent investigator within our heroic paths. And he meets a shape-shifting Khandra, somebody who can supernaturally change shapes. And she says, "How are you better at this than me?" Another character's like, "Oh, how are you better at accents than me?" And so skill trumps power in ways that lend themselves very well to a 20 plus level progression system.
Yeah, and the talent trees being set up the way they are really helps people emulate that. Well, where is my character going to focus their choice of skills in? Like, for this period of time, maybe they really want to focus in on their allomancy. Maybe after that, they really want to focus in on their training as an agent. Right? It's very flexible and allows for some really fun options for your character building. You can be as specialized or as broad based as you want.
That's fair. I mean, that was great too, especially the initiative system of slow turns and fast turns, rather than a straight initiative. You roll a d6 or you roll a d20, and that's the order you go by. Instead, you actually per round you can choose if you go first or if you go last. Played Bridge 9 very recently. That was a really interesting thing we had, because we had players who were doing fast turn on one round, and they decided that, you know what, I can do much more with 3 actions. I'll do slow turn on the next round. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was the plot die, which is a very interesting mechanic that you have when we have to raise the stakes. One question I had regarding that was, oh my god, that is
Here's what a fan made for
I love
us.
that. Yeah.
Here's the actual size.
I love that. I love that. I want both. I'll probably add it onto my pledge. Anyhow,
Big plot die plushie for those
Yes.
listening.
Here's the liquid core one.
oh my god, that's beautiful.
I mean, any kind of fancy die is always good.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
so one thing I wanted to know was, what made you choose?
Is that a D20?
Stop it, Johnny. You.
Oh
I'm gonna
yeah,
lose
sorry.
all
I
my
don't mean to
savings on
distract you
this.
with my Stormlight-filled custom D20.
I'm going to lose all my savings on this.
Drain the stormlight from your dice instead of needing to have marks
Exactly.
around.
What made you guys go for plot dice instead of, let's say, degrees of success like you have in Powered by the Apocalypse systems, or even in Pathfinder?
Yeah, that's another early decision that I can speak to. We've looked at a number of things. We did look at a situation where sort of like how well you roll relative to your result. Like if you're 5 over or 10 over, helps sort of determine a success level. We looked at a system at one point that was 2d20s, and it actually had some similarities to the what Daggerheart does, where in that one you sort of, it was like if you essentially had advantage on every roll, and if you succeeded on both, you had a bigger impact than if you succeeded on just one, and then if you failed on both, so that was those were all things that we looked at. I'd say what it came down to is an early mandate I gave the design team is I said, everything's on the table, any form of core mechanic resolution, et cetera, but it has to be, you have to make a case that this is better than D20. And so because such a huge percentage of the RPG market, like of the global RPG market, like D&D accounts for like 80 to 90% of what players know how to play. And because people are so reluctant to learn new games, that's why Monopoly is as popular as it is. That led us to say D20 unless we can come up with something to upgrade it. And so we did look at a number of different resolution mechanisms, but we found that the option to put a plot die in, as opposed to having a sort of constant success with a cost, failure with a cost sort of system on every single die roll, ended up fitting a lot more how people played. That you want to say every roll matters, and there have been people who have said like, oh, you put the plot die only on important rolls. Every roll should be important. But I disagree. I think you lose drama if everything's at the same level. Just like you wouldn't make a movie where every shot was an extreme close-up or every scene was rapid-fire cuts. You want to be able to have those moments that are more emphasized than others. And if I'm walking around, I'm saying like, hey, I want to just scope out the situation, and the GM knows that there's nothing to scope out, they'll just make a regular test. That's not going to probably have the plot die. It's when you're doing interesting things that you can bring the plot die in and have those more varied consequences. That way you ease some of the mental burden of making every single roll have to have these possible sort of non-binary outcomes of like, ooh, okay, I succeed at pulling myself onto the ledge, but at a cost. Oh no, I've dropped my dagger. Like that can be too much in some indie RPGs for a lot of people's tastes. So yeah, my feeling is like we got to a best of both worlds situation with the plot die, where it's there when you want to have that extra texture, and it means more stuff is happening on each turn, but it doesn't have as much cognitive load for GMs and players as systems that have degrees of success on every single roll.
That's true. I would say this is very GM friendly as well. Finally, something that I don't have to constantly improvise something.
One thing I really like also about the plot die is that I feel it really emulates that feeling of reading a book and getting the like, oh, the characters are doing this thing and oh, look how it got complicated, or really emphasizing the yes but or the yes and the no but feeling of a story progressing. And I as we're translating from that book medium into this RPG medium, I think it does a really amazing job of bringing that feeling over of the Sanderson plot twists and so on. Yeah.
How much of a spoiler can we expect from the books itself? Because again, like we said, some of the players are going to be coming in pretty fresh. They might not have read all of the Stormlight or Mistborn. So how much spoiler in terms of magic or new lore can we expect that you don't have to read all of the books completely through and through to get into it, but just a sort of threshold?
Yeah, I mean, we designed this so that if this is your first exposure to the Cosmere, you're still in great shape. I think if you look at a lot of classic like D&D campaign settings like Eberron, which I love, or Dark Sun or Planescape or Ravenloft, yes, novels exist for all of those, but they're not the primary way people get into those worlds. They get into the world by reading the campaign setting guide or playing through a published adventure that helps really reinforce the feel of that world. And so that's what we've done here. So if you've got the handbook and the world guide, that's all you need. We've even got, as one of the kind of bonus items in our Kickstarter, one of the first stretch goals we unlocked is a 24-page, very visual guide to the world for new players, where you can sort of hand somebody that at the table at the session 0 and say, flip through this. This is what the world looks like. There's not, people have giant crabs as their pack animals. They've got, plants here are weird. There's no soil in most of the world. There's rock and plants that grow like coral or seaweed and then retract when people walk by or the storms sweep through. Some of the cultural things are expressed through that. So this is your crash course of things that you understand about the world once you've read a 1,000-page book, or once you've read now this sort of 24-page crash course guide. So that's something we've been really, because I don't know anybody, or I hardly know anybody who has like a full table of Cosmere fan friends. Just not that many people are into reading. So this is a way to bring more people in. And we've already heard from a lot of people whose first experience has been through some of our adventures. And even something like Bridge 9, every scene is designed to teach you a couple of key world building details. And by the time you're done with Bridge 9, almost about kind of the fundamental world building as you would after reading Way of Kings.
That's awesome. Also, another one of our community questions: how much of Words of Brandon is canon to the RPG? And can a block of cheese still stop a sharp blade?
Well, you'd have to find a block of cheese. I mean, there's not really much dairy in Roshar, is there? Outside of Shen.
There's Shinovar has dairy. Hog's milk is used to make cheese. But hogs are not known for being incredibly productive when it comes to milk. So that's probably Rosharan breeds have been bred for that a little bit. But there's not a lot of dairy. They mostly eat like curries in Eastern Roshar. So Words of Brandon occupy a sort of almost canon state, or sort of canon until proved otherwise, is what I would say. And he sort of canonizes things by putting them in books. Anything you see in these books that is about the world or the way powers work, things like that, that's canon. Of course, we gamify some things.
Yeah.
Like, just because something takes a round in the game doesn't mean that it takes 10 seconds in the world. Like, we've already had some people try to like dig super deep into some of the math, and I've had to be like, no, like that's just how many health points that person has. It's not literally like something canonical to the world. Just like Knights of the Old Republic or something. Like, the story has become canonical and non-canonical at various points, but the exact damage that a cortosis sword does is not something that you should look for as a canonical thing. But yeah, so lots of canon. And on the cheese answer, you can soul cast something into cheese. So we'll just have to find out.
Read and find out, as he says. One innovative roleplay moment or use of a mechanic that surprised you during playtests?
So I think that the greatest moments that I've had during play have been players finding good uses of things like opportunities and complications from the plot die. In a game that I ran during Gen Con, for example, there was a player that ended up rolling some failing a test and then rolling some complication, and they were very excited to actively hinder themselves as a result of it. Right? They like, okay, cool. Well, this didn't go how I wanted to, and now my equipment is broken, and I've lost it, and I'm prone, and I am super happy about it because, like, look how exciting this moment has become. And I think that a lot of people are going to find similar things happening at their tables where the limits to what you see coming out of your opportunities and your complications and what your players and GMs will come up with are going to make your moments very memorable.
I've got a couple fun ones here, both involving surge binding powers. So there was a scene when we were running a game at Dragonsteel convention last year where we were like we were sliding down a cliff and we were going to get hurt. And Lydia, playing an Else Caller, reached out and she turned the boulders that we were about to land on into meat. So that they would be like soft, and we could sort of bounce into them. And right after that, somebody noted that would have been a really good opportunity to raise the stakes. Complete missed the pun opportunity on that one. And another was at the end of that adventure when definitely a raise the stakes moment when we were facing a chasm fiend, and my character and the character belonging to Anthony Joyce Rivera, our initial project lead, he was playing an edge dancer who was always doing crazy things, and he was he got literally chomped up by a chasm fiend, which is like a dragon-sized crustacean, and he reaches out his hand to me and says, take my hand and trust me. And I was like, all right, let's do it. And so I grab his hand thinking I'm going to try to pull him loose, but then he's like, I used the Surge of Abrasion to make us both incredibly slippery, so we slip into the chasm fiend, and then we're going to attack it from the inside out.
Oh my god, that's awesome.
And that was such a great, I love that we built this RPG that has the crunch if you want it. It has, if you're like a Pathfinder player who likes to know the details and all of that, it's there. We built the rules for it. You can find it. But then we've given, through the plot die and through skill-based magic, these opportunities to essentially break the rules to our own game. and to override them from a narrative perspective in a way that still is technically within the rules. And it just all plays so fun and gives you that chance to, in the same way that people will take a critical success or a critical failure and sometimes just go super over the top with that, every opportunity or complication is a chance to do that. The chance to have a moment of triumph or despair. And that, I think, is the heart of the system.
We don't want to keep you around for too long because you have things to do, but we'll let you go. Have a good day, and thank you so much for being here. Okay,
That was that, I guess.
that was it. Whoa. Thank you, Brotherwise Games. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Jillian, for connecting us. And thank you, Ruvaid, for being here.
And I think this would be a perfect moment to also introduce the newest member of our podcast, Amrita, who's been helping us
Yes.
work on the whole graphics part of the Infinite Tavern podcast, making our job easier,
Yes,
I
definitely.
guess.
By the way, guys, the Brotherwise Games Cosmere RPG by Brandon Sanderson Kickstarter is still live. It's going to be live for less than 2 weeks, probably around 12 or 13 days. So if you want to go pledge something, you can do that. You can always select a $1 pledge and just add on things that what you want instead of going for the full hardcover hard copy pledge. So that's something you can do. We have the QR code in the screen itself. You can scan that. You can go to the Kickstarter page directly from there, and that was it.
This is going to be our first video
This is our first
podcast.
video
Podcast,
podcast.
exactly.
Holy shit, we have transcended dimensions now.
Moving across the multiverse,
Yeah.
and there's no stopping us. So I guess.
There is no stopping us.
All right, so the next episode is going to be a regular Q&A episode with just me and Aman. And after that, we will be having a regular actual play episode, which is DM'd by, not me. We will be seeing you soon in the next week. So until
Very
then,
soon.
your roles be good.
You do it again.
I think, I guess, that part is always awkward. So I guess, keeping it on is always, canon for us. Let's keep it like that.
May your roles be good.
They are awkward anyway, so let's keep it awkward.
Okay.
We are awkward.
We are
So let your
awkward.
roles be good.
May your great roles be good. What am I saying? Okay, bye guys. Bye.